Our speakers, as you can see, we have Nick Budlander from Ndifuno Kwazi, researcher there, and we have also Annette May, urban land policy researcher at the Sandler Institute. Annette, I'm not sure if you're going to be joined by the colleague who is with you. Yes? Great, welcome. We'll get a name shortly. Our third speaker, Alison Changana from the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa, unfortunately has had to withdraw at short notice, but I've no doubt that the other two speakers will take us through the issue very well indeed and cover it comprehensively. This issue, we've called it a crisis, the human settlements, or in fact, crises, seems, in my opinion anyway, to not be getting the kind of attention that it deserves, especially with an election around the corner. I guess we are, what's the word I'm looking for? Obsessed with the political outcomes. Will the ANC lose its majority? Will there be coalitions? What's going to happen with independent candidates, etc.? And then just yesterday, we had the signing into law of the National Health Insurance Act, which is again grabbing headlines, even though it's something which may or may not come to pass in a decade's time. And yet, every day, I think all of us physically pass people on the street who are there for lack of housing, amongst other reasons. And we only have to take the trouble to look in our townships, on the Cape Flats here in Cape Town, and other places to see backyard dwellers by the tens and hundreds of thousands who have no home of their own. Somehow, though, we contrive, not the people present here necessarily, but society and many of our politicians contrive to kind of ignore it or underplay it as a problem. So that's why we have come together this morning to try in our own little way to rectify that and to dig a little bit into it, deepen our understanding, and hopefully, of course, in our own various ways, see whether we can contribute to some sort of a solution or to some progress towards a solution to the crises of human settlements. This session is going to be recorded. It is being recorded, and the recording will be available later on. I hope that if the speakers are giving presentations, they'll also give us permission to circulate the presentations. So in that way, we don't just forget about it after the webinar. The format will be that Nick and then Annette will give their presentations, and when that's finished, we'll open it up for discussion, questions, and your comments. Because it's in the webinar format, it's just much easier if you type your comments into the Q&A. That also allows the panelists to see them in sort of real time as you type them, and even begin to answer them, if possible, during their presentations. If anyone does particularly want to speak, just indicate that, and I'll give you permission to speak, or Kenny or Sue, our two other co-hosts, will do that. The last thing before we start is that I will ask you, as I always do at the beginning of these things, to join me in a short moment of silence. As a faith organization, we always do this at the beginning of our meetings. I invite those of you who are people of faith to invoke the Holy Spirit into our meeting. And if not, please just, as I always say, remind yourselves why you've taken the trouble to join us this morning. So just join me for a few seconds. Thank you. Good, thank you very much. Without anything further, I'm going to hand over now to Nick Budlander. Thanks, Nick.
Okay, thank you so much, Mike. And thanks for the opportunity to present here today. So I'm just going to take a second to set up my presentation. Will you please let me know when it's visible?
It's visible now, yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So as Mike said, my name is Nick Budlander, and I'm a researcher at an organization called Ndifuna Ukwazi that is based in Cape Town. And we're an urban land justice organization that very much focuses on housing issues. So I'm going to give a little bit more of a contextual overview, and then we'll move over into Annette's talk, which will be slightly, deal a little bit more with the nitty-gritty of what's currently going on. So, as Mike outlined, the housing situation in Cape Town, in South Africa rather, is currently quite dire. There isn't really another way to describe it. There are millions upon millions of people that live in inadequate housing, and the housing waiting list grows significantly every single year. So, the official number for how many people are on the housing waiting list nationally is around 3 million. But actually, there are way, way more people than that living in a range of sort of inadequate and unsuitable housing conditions across the country. I think the failure of our housing system in many ways has manifested in a huge increase in land occupations, especially in the last few years. As our economy has struggled and as people have really battled to make ends meet, more and more people are essentially being forced into a situation where they feel the only way to look after themselves and their families is to occupy land. And of course, there are a diversity of views on land occupations, but ultimately, many of them are quite, pose many challenges, both for the residents themselves and then for wider attempts at sort of city making and urban policy. Another sort of manifestation of our housing crisis is the significant growth in backyard housing. Statistics are difficult to come by, but when a few years ago we tried to put some together, it looked at like backyard housing was growing faster and delivering more individual homes than all government housing provision and private sector development, formal private sector development combined, which I think is really, really significant. It says a lot about where we are. Another massive factor of our current housing situation has been this huge growth in informal settlements. In 1994, there were around 300 informal settlements in South Africa, and now there are over 3,000. So I think that really does, there are few stats that are as powerful to demonstrate, how housing is being produced and how people are living in our country and across our cities. Another major factor of the current housing situation is that government housing delivery has effectively collapsed. In 2007, 2008, the government was producing around 280,000 homes a year, and that figure is now much closer to 30,000. So we do 9 times less government housing delivery in 2024 than we did in 2007, 2008. Again, which I think is a really, really significant and important kind of statistic to understand. Of course, another major challenge and one that's linked closely to our housing shortage is the question of segregation and also spatial dysfunction. The apartheid government and the colonial government before them basically produced urban policy whose only real intention was to protect the interests of the white minority. And as a result, we have these incredibly dysfunctional cities where the areas that are closest to economic opportunity and closest to good services are generally very low density and generally predominantly lived in by white people. Whereas the areas that are furthest from economic opportunities, furthest from good jobs, schools, hospitals, and all of these important services are generally very, very densely populated and generally populated by people that would have been classified as Black, colored, or Indian under apartheid. So we have almost certainly the most racially segregated cities anywhere on earth. And that's obviously a title which is not one to be proud of, and one which is linked very closely to this question of spatial dysfunction and these cities that are effectively sort of inside out, with most people living on the periphery and the most well-located areas being very sort of sparsely populated. So, there really is increasing recognition across the board, from the state and others, civil society, the private sector, everyone involved in housing, that the current approach is totally unsustainable. There are attempts to address the housing crisis, but actually the backlog is getting worse. And in many ways, segregation and spatial dysfunction are being further entrenched. So it's clear that there's a need for a change, but the question of what form that change will take, I think, is still quite up for grabs. So very, very briefly, I think obviously, we can't talk about the current situation without touching on our past, and that the fact that dispossession, evictions, and displacement were really, really, really fundamental elements of both colonial and apartheid governance and have had a huge enduring effect on our cities today. At least 3 million forced removals happened by the 1980s, and there were still several, many that happened after that. Um, and sorry, and ultimately our cities were completely reshaped under the guise of racist ideology. So, sorry, I think I may have lost a slide there. Okay, anyway. The most well-located areas were reserved for the white minority, while the sort of black, colored, and Indian majority was then relegated to peripheral areas and predominantly only really allowed into the city as a form of cheap labor, effectively. So during apartheid, there was massive housing policy support for the white minority. There were, policy positions that are now considered quite radical around rent control, for instance, for the white minority, and huge amounts of public housing built in really, really central, well-located areas. And then the sort of inverse of that is that the only homes that were really built for the majority of people were homes that were used to maintain the system of cheap labor, and servicing these sort of white centers, homes and businesses. So this type of housing took the form of things like hostels. This is a hostel in Johannesburg. And basically, they were single sex, only men were allowed to live in them, and people's residence in these hostels was dependent or contingent on their employment in some nearby industry. So in 1994, democracy arrived, and obviously, we had this terrible system and this terrible situation where the majority had been denied access to ownership and control over land. Really the 1913 Land Act confined the black population to 7% of the country's land. They could only own land in 7% of the country's land mass, despite the fact that at that point they would have been sort of 85 to 90% of the population. So the main policy response initially was to try and broaden home ownership as widely as possible. And that was through what became known as RDP housing, which was housing formed under the Reconstruction and Development Program. It catered to households earning between 0 and 3,500 Rand a month. And because the focus was really on numbers and building as many homes as possible, it was built on the cheapest available land, which was generally very much on the periphery of cities. And in many ways, that quite seriously entrenched the sort of spatial structure and spatial logic of apartheid, because it didn't disrupt the existing settlement patterns and distribution of different people. Similarly, another big issue with RDP housing is that often it was these huge monofunctional areas so it was houses, but without community facilities, without sort of job opportunities and everything else that is required to build a decent neighborhood, and to make sure that homes actually meaningfully transform people's lives. So, jumping and speeding through a number of decades and a number of different things that happened, eventually different policy responses started to enter our mix. Informal settlement upgrading became and has become an important part of South African housing policy and practice. But this was only after significant struggle and some large court cases effectively, which tried to convince the state that actually informal settlements won't be eradicated, and evicting and demolishing them is a much more short-sighted response than actually trying to upgrade them and improve where people currently live. There was also a shift to BNG, or breaking new ground, around 2004. And this was on the back of the recognition of the kind of issues that I just spoke about with the RDP housing in terms of location and in terms of the sort of monofunctional nature of these neighborhoods. So, around 2004, the state realized actually we need to build slightly denser housing that's better quality and in better locations. And that's when this idea of breaking new ground, or BNG housing, was introduced. I'll speak a little bit later just to how that didn't really have the desired effect, but it was a big moment in South African housing policy, and it was a recognition of the need to kind of shift. A few years later, social housing was introduced around 2008, 2009, and this is rental housing for households who earn between 1,850 Rand a month and 22,000 Rand a month. And it's the only government housing program that targets well-located areas, and that targets spatial integration. It's the only one that's funded in such a way that it can be built and managed in very well-located parts of our cities. Similarly, emergency and alternative accommodation, became more and more important, and there have been various different attempts to provide it, and different municipalities and provinces have provided it in a number of different ways. But ultimately, I think we've really struggled with that, and actually struggled to kind of get that right. And I'm happy to speak about that later if anyone's interested. And then of course there have also been a range of other government housing policies, for instance, the maintenance of older council housing that was built during apartheid, hostel upgrading projects, and a whole range of other kind of government interventions. But ultimately, and very sadly, in my opinion, all of these interventions are now in decline. There have been significant housing budget cuts over the last sort of 5-6 years, and also something of a shift in focus. But what I really want to highlight here is that often, if one critiques the state or critiques a municipality or a provincial government, they'll turn around and say, no, well, actually, we don't have the money to build these homes. And of course, that having sufficient budget is very, very important. If you can't pay for something, then you can't do it. But the relationship between budget and delivery is not linear. It's not simple when it comes to housing. And the reason I say that is that, in 2007, 2008, when we were producing about 280,000 homes a year, there weren't big budget cuts until around 2019, 2020. But yet during that period, housing delivery declined massively. So it's not just about money. There's actually a range of other factors that are equally important to do with state capacity, for instance, and institutional capacity and development. So ultimately, I think rather than the budget cuts being the main reason for this big decline in delivery, I think it's a decline in government and institutional capacity that has had a larger effect. And similarly, there are diminishing returns because the most easily accessible land, a lot of the most easily accessible land has been developed. So, it then means you have to go for land that's either more expensive or more complicated, and that slows down the rate of delivery. So budget is extremely, extremely important, but that's not the only reason or the only factor that significantly affects how housing is delivered. So just wanted to very quickly show you, this is an image of BNG housing, breaking new ground housing. So that's kind of contrasted with the matchbox or RDP housing that we're all familiar with. It's slightly better density, often in slightly better areas, but unfortunately has still largely failed to disrupt the current spatial distribution and dysfunctional urban dynamics in our cities. Then, this picture is pixelated while being exported. My apologies, but this is just an example of a small informal settlement that's been reblocked and upgraded. So informal settlement upgrading often looks at reblocking, so changing the layout and accessibility of different settlements. And then another major element is services. And this image is very blurry, but you may be able to see some electricity lines and at the back some toilets and bathrooms that have been provided. So, another important element of all of this and of the housing question in South Africa has been land reform, which is made up of restitution, redistribution, and tenure reform, and was ultimately meant to address the legacy of apartheid and colonial dispossession and evictions and forced removals. Unfortunately, these attempts have really largely failed. On the right-hand side of the screen is an image of District 6 in Cape Town, which is one of the most iconic examples of forced removals, where 60,000 people were forcibly removed from this area. For context, the Cape Town city centre now has, less than 15,000 people living in it. So the Cape Town city centre was a lot more dense and a lot more diverse during apartheid than it is now, which I think is in many ways quite tragic. There've been many different land restitution attempts, for instance, the District 6 attempt, but really they've produced very, very, very little housing, and often a number of projects have ultimately failed. So I think that's another sort of important element of the housing question in South Africa. Finally, and I think Annette will speak a bit more about, some specific elements of this, we are at this moment of this big housing policy shift. So the last time we saw a significant housing policy shift in South Africa was around 2004, with some additional programs introduced around 2008, 2009. And since 2014, we've been hearing that the government is going to shift its current approach and move to something else. But that process has now happened in a very, very, very rushed way. And we've ended up with in my opinion, with a sort of proposed policy that isn't coherent and that doesn't really make sense for our country. So firstly, there have been these large budget cuts that I spoke about. And secondly, there's been this shift to site and service, which means that instead of providing actual homes, the state is now proposing instead that people get a plot of land, perhaps with a service connection or a slab, and then they must build their own homes. Of course, there are a number of risks there, and we'll probably speak to that a bit more. So on one level, it's a pragmatic response. There's been this huge decline in housing budget, and perhaps this is a way of building more homes for more people. But on another level, there are huge questions about the location of where these homes or where the site and service will be provided, what funding arrangements will be used to fund it, what institutional arrangements will make sure that the government successfully delivers this, and what capacity will there be on many levels. How will communities be capacitated to build decent homes, and how will the government itself be capacitated to run this program out successfully? Because if people aren't given adequate support, then it could have disastrous housing and spatial outcomes. Ultimately, this big policy shift, moving the state from a provider towards an enabler, is still very, very unclear. I think in many ways it's politically disastrous to try and say to the population, look, we used to provide actual brick and mortar homes, but now all we're going to provide is serviced land. So I think that's also a factor that might explain why we haven't seen much about it publicly, even if those working in the housing sector have been hearing about this shift for, about 10 years. The housing policy white paper that was produced and that will eventually become our main housing policy in South Africa is really quite incoherent. The different sections of the document don't speak to each other. They often contradict each other. They don't contain any real details or explanation of how the shift will happen. And the process of producing this policy has been extremely, extremely chaotic. That it basically feels like it's being rushed through at the last minute so that it can be assented to in time for the new administration, when actually what we need is a much slower, more considered approach where there, a more meaningful number of groups can give proper input and guide the process. So I'm going to stop there for now, and hand back the mic, as it were. But I'm of course very happy to answer any questions or to elaborate further on anything that I've said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Not a lot of good news there so far. So, Annette, I hope maybe you'll have some. I'll just draw your attention to a couple of questions already in the Q&A. We can get to them, but Annette, if you've seen them, you might be able to address them as well while you speak. So let's go to Annette then. If you want to switch on your video. And Nick, if you can take down your screen, then thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mike. I'm not sure if I have the good news that you were hoping I'd be able to share, but thank you, Nick, for setting such a firm foundation for my input. I'm going to just attempt to share my screen. If you'll just bear with me for a minute. Okay, are you able to see?
Yes, we've got it, yeah.
There we go. So thank you once again for the opportunity to present. I have with me, as Mike mentioned earlier, my director, the director of Isandla Institute, Miriam van Donk, and she will join in as the discussion unfolds. As indicated, I am a researcher at Isandla Institute in the Urban Land Program. And historically, we have focused on the rights, the needs, the agency of residents living in informality in urban areas. And this has meant that we've had a focus on the upgrading of informal settlements. And more recently, in partnership with the Development Action Group, a focus on backyard housing. I thought that in starting off and anchoring our presentation, it would be good just to reflect on the title of the webinar, which is looking at human settlements in crisis. And it draws a bit on what Mike was saying in his introduction, in that we see manifestations of crisis and crises all the time. We see it either in evictions, reports around occupations, the devastating fires in the inner city buildings in Johannesburg, and then also the increased incidences relating to risks around climate change. And these we see every year. We see flooding, we see the risks of fires in informal settlements. And so in a sense, when we look at some of these manifestations, and even in the way that it is narrated in reporting, and even in our own perceptions, we sometimes see it as disparate manifestations of crisis, but do we connect the dots to see the huge human settlement crisis that we are dealing with? And so the reality is that a large proportion of people continue to live in informal, insecure, undignified housing. And statistics would say that there's 1 in 7 urban residents who live in informal housing. And the reasons for this are complex and varied, and Nick touched on some of these. The problem or the challenge lies in the fact that this isn't just a description of what happened in the past. It's ongoing. So people continue to fall within the gap of state programming and private rental. We know that the private rental market is not providing for marginalized communities. And so housing programming has been unable to respond with the speed or the comprehensiveness or the relevance to meet the needs of people who are living in tenure insecurity. And so they must then, the impact is that people rely on their own limited resources to meet their housing needs, which means that it's a perpetuation of the status quo, inadequate, unsafe housing accommodation. And this in turn manifests in the growth, not only the growth, but the persistence of informal settlements and backyard housing. And so if we know what the reality is, we know what the challenge is, what is the need? The need is to have government or programming that is relevant and meets these particular needs, these specific needs. And so we see that it's not simply a crisis or crises that can easily be defined, but that it's a confluence of crises, of both housing, inadequate structures, of where people live, crime and violence, poverty, rampant unemployment, and the increasing and evolving challenges around climate change and what that means for people, particularly living in informality. So if we've defined what the crisis is, what is the point of intervention that would allow us to craft appropriate and sustainable pathways towards meeting those needs? And the question is it programming? Nick touched on institutional capabilities. Is it just a lack of capability in the state? Is it finance? If we threw everything and expanded the budget, would that be the solution? And I think Nick mentioned that the relationship between budgeting and housing delivery is certainly not a linear process. And so we would argue that intervention is required in all of those subcomponents, but that an accessible and entry point, an accessible tool and instrument would have to be in reviewing policy. And that opportunity has come in the review of the white paper process, as the white paper on human settlements and the process surrounding that, which has been many years in the making. And the opportunity now would be to review what has our human settlement sector been able to do so far, and what is necessary to move us out of the crisis that we face? We would argue that there needs to be a key shift, not only in policy premise, but even in societal expectations. And so we know that there is, to start with, the Section 26 right of access to adequate housing. We know that, in a sense, it has been conflated with access to a house. And I see in the chat earlier, someone asked, does living in an informal settlement or a backyard informal structure, do they qualify as having a house, or are they homeless? And this is part of the question that we're going to delve into. So does it mean that the right of access to adequate housing needs to translate into a home, brick and mortar with four walls? And we know that the promise of a house for all has been used as a political bargaining tool by many politicians. And in fact, I think it was interesting. I just read this week in one of the manifestos of our contesting political parties that they would provide a 3-bedroom spacious home for everyone. Now, we know that practice and research has proved, due to the variety of reasons, that a house for all is simply unrealistic. It's not possible. And so what we are arguing is that there needs to be these critical shifts between housing as a product, as a manifestation, a physical manifestation, versus housing as a multifaceted, incremental processes, which actually embraces the different realities and the typologies which we've just spoken about, which includes informal settlements and backyard housing. Beyond being this multifaceted process, housing cannot be a top-down process or product. It needs to be people-centered, a neighborhood approach to human settlements. Oh, that seemed to be a bit stuck. There we go. So how do we have this policy shift? The first would be that we have to move away from this dominant perception that we are all somehow moving in an upward trajectory along the property ladder, that people who are living in tenure insecurity simply have to get their foot on the ladder, and then there would be that upward trajectory from inadequate.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Can everybody still hear me?
Just give it to you.
Mike, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. There's an interruption. We'll try to deal with that, but you carry on, Annette.
Sure, no problem. So we want to move away from the idea of a property ladder, where someone living in tenure insecurity, if you're living in an informal settlement, that somehow you would be able to move to something with better tenure security, better accommodation, and finally achieve that promise of a home for all. Rather, we see that housing insecurity for people living in informality is not along that upward trajectory of a property ladder, but rather that people live along a continuum of housing insecurity. And so for those who live in formal housing in townships, we know that the cost burden of housing is incredibly high. It is the dominant household expense, often at the cost of other necessities. For those who are living in informality, be it an informal settlement or backyard housing, we know that it's commonly characterized by poor quality housing. There's a safety issue, overcrowding, and a great risk of eviction. And so, with the ultimate risk being homelessness. And so we see that there isn't that upward trajectory, but that people move rather between different housing scenarios. And this depends on their socioeconomic and personal circumstances. And an example of this would be during COVID-19, where someone a family may be relatively secure in a backyard housing setup on the earth, but because of a loss of income, very quickly you see that regression in terms of insecurity. They may be evicted, they may be forced to join an existing informal settlement, or even new land occupations is what we commonly saw. And so the point here again is to move away from housing as a property ladder and accept the reality that there are different housing insecurity needs, which may result in even homelessness. And so despite the rhetoric, we find that there's decreased investment in the upgrading of informal settlements. And Nick spoke to this as well. If we look at the prevalence of informal settlements, pre-COVID estimates, which were very conservative, was 3,400 informal settlements. And we know that during the course of COVID and even in the aftermath of COVID, we saw an exponential increase in the formation of even new informal settlements. And so if we were to look at census data, we know that 8.1% of the population is estimated to live within informal settlements, but we know that there are significant concerns about the accuracy of the statistics. So even this is estimated to be higher. And if you look at this graph on the right of the screen, you'll see that, and Nick mentioned that in the medium term, from 2018 to 2023, we saw a significant decline in the delivery of top structure, in the delivery of housing. You see that would be that green line. And then also in the delivery of service sites and stands, which means that there is even slow progress in the respect of the upgrading of informal settlements program. What does this translate to? It means simply that the state is not delivering and that there is a vacuum in delivery. The second manifestation, we would argue, is around backyard housing. We know that backyard housing has been an organic response to housing shortages. We know that it is not transient, that there's longevity of the sector, and in fact, exponential growth. And we see this particularly in the metros. If we look at the example of the city of Tshwane, we see from 2001 to 2022, there was a 700% increase in the number of people who were living in backyard housing. And so despite the fact that backyard housing presents such a significant source of housing opportunity as well as local economic development, and when I say local economic development, our research has shown that many of the landlords are older female landlords who are using their only major asset to leverage rental income. So despite the fact that there is both there are opportunities in terms of housing, in terms of local economic development, we find that this sector is the only one that has no comprehensive policy, to guide interventions, even budgetary interventions in terms of enabling the sector. And so there is, beyond almost a physical invisibility in that backyard housing is often located at the back of homes on an earth, there's an invisibility of the sector. And how does this translate? It translates into inadequate access to basic services, unsafe accommodation, and an increased risk of tenure insecurity. even though we don't have this comprehensive policy or guidance or even budgetary commitment, municipalities are increasingly acknowledging the presence and the opportunities that are found within the sector. But they say that they urgently require guidance on how to meet the needs of the sector, how to actually mitigate some of the consequences, some of the downstream costs of failing to provide. And here we're talking about access to services. If there's a failure to provide refuse removal or waste management services, we find that there are increased burdens which the municipality must bear. If there is insufficient security of tenure in the relationship between landlords and tenants, it often leads to evictions, with the downstream costs of municipalities having to bear that. And so the question is, how do municipalities, or what is the guidance needed to enable this sector to provide housing opportunities, to facilitate local economic growth, and also enrich communities who are living in this sector? So there are some sustainable pathways to change, and we touched on that earlier, is this movement from housing as a product to housing a human settlements approach. Housing or human settlements as an active verb. What does that actually mean? What does it translate into? It means recognizing those housing realities which are manifested in both informal settlements and backyard housing. Not only the realities which exist there, but capitalizing on the opportunities to enable people to build better. Remember that this isn't necessarily forward-looking. We are looking at something that is already organically happening. It is also investing and co-creating in quality, safe neighborhoods. And so what this is premised on, and what we saw in the previous graph, in the previous slide, is the state is declining in terms of housing provision in any form and shape. And so an enabling approach would be acknowledging the shift from the state as a provider to an enabler in these particular typologies and meeting the particular needs of these groups. So if we were to unpack a bit what it means to enable the self-build housing agenda and neighborhood development. Self-build recognizes that without assistance, people living in informality will build simply what they can afford, what is within their current resources. And this perpetuates the status quo of unsafe housing, undignified housing. The right to build allows municipalities to tap into what is already happening, to tap into the latent willingness, the agency of communities to incrementally build for themselves, to realize top structure consolidation. The reality is, however, that communities, residents require both financial and technical assistance for self-build. So there's different types of housing support that is required and that can be provided to residents. And one of our core advocacy projects at Isandla Institute revolves around the concept of housing support centers that can provide a range of services, from information to enabling to creating networks that residents can draw on. There needs to be a recognition that in self-build, inherent in self-build, is economic and job creation potential. In that, as self-build is generating, it becomes a self-generating process in terms of an economic value chain around housing construction. We touched briefly on the fact that there are climate change risks, the increased flooding, increased fire, the ability for structures to regulate temperature. All of these are real. It adds challenges, but also opportunities, in that if we are embarking on self-build enabling, there is an opportunity to harness alternate building technologies that are climate resilient and would help to mitigate some of those costs. Importantly, is that the state, in its enabling role, self-build must take place with partnerships with stakeholders and role players that are involved in the construction process. There must be that partnership approach. If we turn to neighborhood development, moving again from the product of a house to what comprises a thriving, dignified, safe neighborhood. Moving beyond just where housing is located to what is going to enable and create the development and fostering of a neighborhood that people want to live in. And so this would be a combination of both physical interventions. Do we have safe pathways? Is there sufficient lighting? Are there sufficient social amenities like libraries, clinics? Are there social interventions? And this is a human settlements neighborhood development approach that we are trying to advocate for. It also really puts people at the center of a human settlements approach. And traditionally, we know that it's been a top-down approach to delivery. A people-centered approach means that people are part of envisioning what their neighborhood looks like, of planning, program execution, monitoring and evaluation. And here we are asking for processes that are fluid, that are responsive, that are relevant. And of course, skills development, job creation, and livelihoods dimensions are integral to this approach. But we have a cautionary note here, is that if we are talking about the state as the enabler, we are not talking about state withdrawal. Rather, we are talking about a shift in programmatic focus. And so we argue that there are some indisputable duties that the state must provide and fulfill. So for one, it would be the responsibility to provide housing for specified vulnerable groups that are unable to provide for themselves. For those living in conditions of informality, such as informal settlements or backyard housing, there are some principal points of intervention which we believe must be highlighted. And this is the existing duty that free basic services and basic service provision is rolled out equitably and sustainably to all of those living in informality. Then we know that municipalities have a range of instruments to accommodate density. We're looking at land use management tools, spatial integration to ensure that those living in areas of informality, we avoid the disruption of relocation and socioeconomic dislocation when we embark on self-build and improvement. And then the state must act as a facilitator in terms of both private sector and civil society contributions, as well as partnerships. And this can be done in terms of independently or in partnership with the state. And so as indicated, there is an opportunity, there is a window for change. We have this white paper for human settlements, but we argue that an effective, relevant, sustainable policy approach that results in a white paper will only be fit for purpose and will only be able to guide the human settlement sector appropriately if it embraces, if it addresses both the challenges and the opportunities which I covered. And fundamentally, it must also shift from that housing approach to address the four big societal challenges. And we would say that is adequate housing, violence and crime prevention by creating livable, safe, dignified neighborhoods, jobs and livelihoods creations, and then creating or addressing climate resilience. Thank you. That's where I'll end.
Thank you very much, Annette. We have a number of questions already in the Q&A, but we also have with us Cholofelo Rasihlako, who I understand is from the Department of Human Settlements. Cholofelo, I know you've put a question, you had a little discussion with Nick in the Q&A. If you'd like to join the discussion and give us a perspective from the department's side, we'd be very happy to hear from you. If you can just indicate, I will promote you to panelist, and then if you choose, you can join the discussion. Okay. Cholo has declined to become a panelist, so that's fine. But he has made a point to Nick about the incoherence of the white paper, and that discussion will go forward. So let's begin the discussion then. I'm going to invite the panelists to just have a look at the questions in the Q&A and answer them as you wish. But I'd like to start with one other question, and that's simply, are there places in the world that we can look at and learn from when it comes to feasible and sustainable solutions to the kinds of problems that you have both outlined? Because sometimes one gets the impression that human settlements are in crisis in many, many parts of the world, the developing world, the developed world, etc. One reads about increasing rates of homelessness, even in wealthy societies. One reads about, for example, those great high-rise state housing initiatives that were put up after the Second World War in so many cities in Britain and some other countries in Europe, now being demolished because it's in some cases been decided that they weren't such a good solution after all. So are there success stories that you can point us to and that should be influencing our policymakers?
Well, I see Annette still writing, so I'll jump in there. I certainly think there are success stories from across the world, and there's often success is sort of varied and imperfect. I'm not saying that there's one simple solution that could be easily imported to South Africa, but specifically looking at the issue of site and service and this idea that people will have to build more housing for themselves. I think South and Central America, particularly countries like Colombia and in some ways Brazil, provide really, really good examples of the type of interventions that are necessary to ensure that people build homes and neighborhoods that are decent. And I think a large part of those interventions relate to the type of assistance and support offered by the state, as Annette so clearly outlined in the talk. So in the Colombian example, for instance, there are large areas that used to be quite sort of dysfunctional informal settlements. And because people were granted tenure security and because they knew that they wouldn't be evicted, that allowed them to invest more in their homes and their neighborhoods. And then because the state tried in various ways to actually support people to build decent housing and to provide services, and that they were quite sort of pragmatic in accepting, look, this is a process that will take some time. And actually, there'll be various opportunities for us to intervene in it. I think those are the type of examples that we should be looking to when it comes to this question of site and service and the broader policy shift. But then, there are also much more specific examples that you could speak to around, for instance, how to develop and manage well-located rental housing. And those come from a range of different contexts. So I think the key thing is that we have to be open to learning from what's happened elsewhere, and almost most importantly, to learn from what's actually happened here, because I think that's a big issue, is that there hasn't been enough sort of reflection and adjustment based on the various interventions that we've tried. So I'm interested whether, Annette has anything to add, so I'll leave that there.
I think what Nick has said is that there are examples that we can learn from and that there isn't a model that we can easily transpose and say this will work here. But I think when we look at some of the success stories in other places, it is a willingness to engage with the reality. Often our planning processes, often our policy making is forward-looking. To achieve the cities that we want to achieve, what would be ideal, without necessarily dealing with the existing realities, with what we are grappling with at the moment. And so that is important. And also interventions around wherever you may be would be around security of tenure. Are we secure? once that security is attained, provides the foundation for doing more. Are there access to basic services? And then, of course, the other concerns around every neighborhood: is there safety? Is there inclusiveness? How do we move beyond this othering in terms of people who live in informal settings? Something that we have come across in our research, and in addition to the South American, Colombian, Brazilian examples, would be how housing support centers have worked, and what it can do in different instances and contexts. And so, for instance, in the Indian context, we find that it has resulted in actually the construction and the production of alternate building materials that has worked in that particular context. And so there are lessons that we can learn, and as pilots unfold in different places, there are different consequences and different lessons, but the progress comes in the doing as well. So there must be a translation from perception, from into translation, into implementation. And also there needs to be a process that is alive to change. So if something is not working, how do we ensure that there is that reactivity, that there is taking into account also building on local expertise, on local knowledge that is inherent in the communities that we want to serve?
Thanks. Let's look at some of the questions that have been posted in the Q&A. I think we'll try to go roughly in order. The first one that's not been dealt with is this question of the link between what's called the paralyzing tentacles of the construction mafia and government's delivery of housing. I mean, I think certainly in some parts of the country, including here in Cape Town, the authorities have named that as a reason for some housing projects being delayed or even effectively abandoned. And so what's your take on this as a contributor nationally to the problem of human settlements? Nick, do you want to? You're nodding, so you can go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I think it's important to understand that the construction mafias and the sort of extortion activity is certainly not the main explanatory factor for the sort of failure to deliver, but it is an incredibly serious issue that seems to be becoming more and more serious, almost, every day, basically. And I think there are already a number of factors that kind of constrain the state's ability to control and manage land in a context like ours, where so much urban growth is driven by informality and by a housing system, by a formal housing system that doesn't actually cater to the needs of the majority of people and that doesn't meet their kind of income levels. So it compounds a lot of issues. And I think it's a serious and increasing threat. And there are very, very clear examples of projects that have been basically stopped completely because of the sort of extortion and racketeering that we're increasingly seeing across our country. The Global Initiative on Transnational Organized Crime have just released a research report in last week, maybe, that looks at this question in a bit more detail. And the South African Cities Network have also produced some research on extortion. And I would highly recommend looking at both of those resources to really get a stronger grip on it. But yeah.
Thanks. Annette, do you want to maybe respond to that one and also look at the next question, which is around whether private sector housing developers ought to be levied or otherwise required to make a contribution to social housing? And I think there may be some examples of where that is already happening. Maybe you could comment on that.
Sure. Not to add too much to what Nick has said around this construction mafia, and those two reports it's quite an eye-opener in terms of the extent to which it exists within the sector. I think the point is that this needs to be proactively addressed. And if we're looking at that human settlements approach as opposed to a housing approach as a product, that this would be something essentially that has to, it's not a crime problem, essentially, that one particular sector department needs to deal with. It is a human settlements problem now, and it needs to be proactively addressed head on. It can't be something that is just reported on. There needs to be a strategy to address it and to deal with it, because it is becoming quite an important problem. I think in terms of private sector housing developers, we do see certain metros have inclusionary housing processes where a certain portion needs to be provided for social housing, and we believe that that is absolutely important. We also believe, however, that it's not only about a particular portion, because you could imagine that it's not a huge proportion which would be dedicated or produced in terms of these inclusionary policies. What we are saying is that there's a gap in the market in terms of private sector developers. We are seeing the rise in our work around micro developers, around developers who are willing and seeing the opportunity to actually develop in the context of backyard housing. We have developers who are invested in seeing a return on that. And the question is, how are we going to enable that development, widen that market, make it accessible to more micro developers, to more people to get involved, and also just to improve the quality of offerings within that sector.
Thank you. Perhaps that leads to then one of the next questions, and around housing is provided through whatever particular method and so on by the state. And then, as the questioner says, we run into the problem of people then selling the house that has been allocated or provided or given to them. It was obviously something that happened a lot with RDP houses many, many years ago. At a broader level, how do you address this? That on the one hand, you're wanting to maintain an affordable housing stock. You're wanting to make affordable housing, to provide it in inner city areas, near workplaces, etc., obviously, which makes it more and more desirable. How do you, in a word, force people to live there and prevent them from selling the house that is supposedly their house? And if you do that, is it really theirs?
Yeah, some tough questions there, Mike. I wanted to very, very briefly touch on the previous question that Annette spoke to about, trying to get developers to include a portion of affordable housing within their developments. Just very briefly, we have done a lot of work around that, and produced quite a lot of research and done quite a lot of advocacy on that type of policy approach, which is called inclusionary housing. But exactly as Annette said, I think that the income dynamics in our country, the fact that we are such an unequal country, and then also that developers still need to be able to extract some type of profit, means that the affordable housing contribution, the number of affordable homes that can feasibly be included within one of these sort of developments, is generally relatively low. So we see it mainly as a spatial intervention to try and get more affordable housing in well-located areas. But ultimately, it's very unlikely to be able to deliver the type of numbers that we need unless humongous incentives are offered to the developers. So some incentives will be required to make it feasible for them to include some affordable homes within their private developments. But, we can't expect massive numbers from that. So then on the question of selling homes and resale restrictions, for instance, this is a very contentious question, right? And it cuts to the heart of a number of different, or two sort of big different approaches to housing provision and housing policy. In some countries, like South Africa in the 90s, the main focus of housing policy was increasing home ownership. And home ownership can, have enormous benefits for individual households and for economic development and everything else. But actually, when someone is very, very cash poor and all of a sudden they have this house, which is an asset that they can leverage, it is 100% rational to then say, actually, hold on, I'll move back into an informal settlement elsewhere and try and leverage some money out of this asset. I think that's a response that many of us would pursue in a similar situation, especially when the homes are built in areas that don't necessarily give people this huge advantage, this access to, quality services and jobs and everything else. So, while ownership creates this asset, which can be valuable for families, it does, it has a problem that family will then eventually sell that home into the market, and over time, that house will become increasingly expensive and won't be accessible to someone else, who requires affordable housing. Whereas what the organization that I work for has advocated for, especially in well-located areas and on very high-value land, is that the state should rather pursue social housing, which is rental housing, because rental housing allows many families to benefit from one individual unit over time. And especially if you're building a home in a very well-located area where there's a high cost to the state, then it doesn't make sense for that subsidy to go to one family who then gets this very nice large subsidy, but then there's less money for the next person. So it's a complicated question. It's contentious especially because of our history and because people were denied ownership for so long. So that's the kind of position we've taken, but I fully understand other positions on this issue too.
Mm-hmm. Annette?
I think Nick has covered me. Thank you.
Right, thanks. Let's go back to the questions. There are more and more coming in. Question around property rates. Cape Town has many large buildings standing empty in the CBD, on the fringes. Changing municipal rates policy could disincentivize this speculative activity. I think we're dealing here with the policy of rating on the improved value of land rather than just on the plain land value. So if you hold land with a huge building on it, it's the same as just holding. It's cheaper to you to hold unoccupied land, whereas if you had a land rates policy, you would be incentivized to build on it and put it to work. Comments on that one?
Sure, unless you want to go for it, Annette. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think Michael's question or suggestion is a good one. So we see fewer vacant buildings in central Cape Town than perhaps in some of our other cities, like in Johannesburg and eThekwini, for instance, but there are still some here. And I think the best way to deal with that vacancy is exactly through a policy of rates and taxation. Because what some people do is they buy a property which they have no intention of developing or maintaining, and they leave it vacant, or they allow, they kind of abandon it, and they wait for the land value of that building or the value of that building to increase because of the actions of other people. Maybe the state makes an investment in a nearby piece of transport infrastructure, or maybe surrounding property owners develop their land. So the speculators effectively buy something, abandon it, and wait for other people to raise the value. Speculation is incredibly harmful for our cities, and it sort of encourages a lack of productivity, and it encourages inefficiency. So the way to deal with speculation on land is to basically say, okay, if you leave your land or your building undeveloped, the longer you leave that undeveloped and the less you put into it, the more highly you will be taxed, either through rates or another form of municipal taxation. And then ultimately, once your outstanding rates and tax bill is more than the value of the building itself, then that building should be taken into public ownership and redeveloped. And that's a very, very, very common strategy that cities across the world, you know, throughout Brazil, Chile, across many other parts of the global south, and many cities in the global north employ. So I think it's a good suggestion, and one that we certainly should be pursuing, especially in cities like Johannesburg.
Okay. Annette, let's just jump in if you want to add anything there. Yeah. Just going through the new questions. From Tony Markovitz, do we not also have to deal with the reasons for the nature of the urbanization which results in our current situation? It's not necessary. Is it not also necessary to focus more on influencing the reasons for and the nature of spatial distribution through strategic investment in economies of towns and cities, which could be regenerated, provide for more holistic settlements, and reverse the pattern of settlement in the country? So, okay, if I understand correctly, we're dealing with large-scale urbanization, like just about every other developing country is. Does it make sense to try to intervene to slow that, reverse that? Does rural development play a part in all of this? Annette?
I'm phoning a friend.
I
Miriam,
think that.
go ahead.
So Miriam from the Isandla Institute. So yeah, Tony, as you undoubtedly know, it sounds great and obvious in some respects, but the reality is very different, right? So the one thing, of course, is to appreciate that when we talk about urbanization and the growing demand in urban areas, we have to separate out three different trends. The one is the migration trend, an influx of people looking for opportunities, particularly work-related opportunities. The second is natural urban growth, so a growth in demand because families are growing. And the third, I think, is the phenomenon of household composition and configurations changing. And so people wanting to have their own space, the younger generation wanting to have their own space and not live with the adults and the grandparents, and so forth. And so those are all in and of themselves quite complex demographic dynamics. In terms of the kind of the question whether investments in kind of the areas where people come from and investments in those economies would curb the tide. So there may be some truth in it, but the fact of the matter is that if you look at the economic potential in those areas, the economic potential is very limited, and it will take an enormous amount of both public and private, but particularly public investment to really create the economies that are needed there for people to remain there. So the question is whether that's money well spent, given that the return on that investment is likely to be very limited. And of course, we know that globally, urbanization is a reality, including that movement from different typologies of municipalities, from the rural areas to smaller towns to intermediate towns to cities. And in fact, we've seen that the intermediate cities have had the highest growth rates in more recent years. So I don't think that it is really a workable solution. And even if there is some elements of value in that, it is not going to change the fact that the demands in the bigger cities and secondary cities are going to be such that significant public and private investments will be needed to improve the living conditions, the housing conditions, and the quality of neighborhoods, and of course the access to economic opportunity.
Thank you, Miriam. Let's move on. Question here from Pumla Makoba about sustainable development. Is the focus on bringing more people into the city or growing the city to reach impoverished people? Because skyscrapers and overly dense populations are seen as unsustainable now architecturally and from an urban design perspective. Sometimes if you fly over Johannesburg, you get the impression that they're expanding the city to just reach just about the whole country fairly soon, rather than going upwards.
Yeah, so I mean, I think yeah, it's an important question too, and one that we hear often. Ultimately, though, the way that our cities are growing is they're sprawling. They're growing out, further and further and further and wider and wider and wider, rather than densifying. And that type of urban sprawl is quite disastrous for a number of reasons. One, socially it's unsustainable because it means that people are disconnected from economic centers and from areas where they can access higher quality and readily available services. There's no way that the government can continue to afford to build more and more hospitals further and further out and to lay longer and longer distances of pipe. So it's also financially unsustainable. I like to use the example of a piece of sewage infrastructure. If you have a denser city, then that 100 meters of pipe can perhaps service 100 households. But if your city is sprawling and spread out, then that 100 meters of pipe can maybe only service one household. So financially, it's entirely unsustainable for municipalities to continue extending services over these greater and greater and greater distances. So I think we really have to focus on densification and intensification. And that doesn't mean, building skyscrapers in every neighborhood. And that doesn't mean trying to fit everybody into traditional city centers. But what it does mean is that the sprawling nature of our settlements and the vast amount of vacant and underutilized, especially public land that is available, must be infilled with some dense development. So personally, I'm also not a fan of skyscrapers. I don't think I think they are unsustainable now from a number of different perspectives. But our cities are so low density that even if you built a 2-story house, even if you built an additional story on all of the 1-story houses, that would have a humongous impact on the density of our cities. So, I think that it's better to aim for 3- and 4-story walk-ups in most neighborhoods, and that other neighborhoods will need taller, more intense buildings. But that ultimately densification and intensification are crucial from a social perspective, from a financial perspective, and then very, very much from an environmental perspective as well. Because, extending services over long distances, that has a huge environmental cost, more pipes, more metal, more concrete, etc. But also it entrenches this terrible traffic and congestion that our cities have. So people have to spend more time in their cars, which of course also has serious environmental implications. So I think, yeah, it's essential that we densify and intensify land use in our urban areas in South Africa.
Thank you. Just moving on, and forgive me if I skipped past 1 or 2 questions that I think may have been partially answered. There's apparently the HSRC is working on a draft green paper on homelessness, while the Department of Human Settlements, as we know, has published a white paper on housing. Question is there policy alignment with the processes and the contents of both of those? Do we have an answer to that question? No?
I mean, just very shortly from my side, I see a net lean forward. I would say no. Yeah, quite simply no. There's almost nothing in the white paper that speaks to homelessness or interventions around homelessness. So I haven't read the draft green paper on homelessness, but because it doesn't appear in the draft white paper on human settlements, yeah, there doesn't appear to be alignment. I don't know, Annette, maybe you've picked up something different.
No, we've not had sight of that either. And so, yeah, we'd have to conclude the same.
Yeah, I just see that Pumla, who posted that question, has raised a hand. So Pumla, if you want to go ahead with your comment.
Yes, thank you. So I attended the homelessness white paper drafting in Boxburg a couple of weeks ago, and I did pose a question as to what are we defining homelessness as? And they did not want to include shack dwellers and informal settlements as part of being homeless, because they have different definitions of homeless, as in like you either street homeless, or you have no roof, or you're living in a government provided shelter. And therefore, in their eyes, if you're living in a shack, you're no longer homeless. And I explained to them how someone who's living in a shack is the same as being homeless, because you have no basic services, and therefore you are living in a space that is dysfunctional, it's undignified, and also unsafe. And speaking to the different sectors, the one lady was from the city of Johannesburg. She works in the homeless sector. And the other gentleman, he was from the city of Ekurhuleni, and he works in community development. And they were both on the same mindset of they don't want to include housing issues into the homelessness sector, because they see that the housing sector and human settlement sector are having so much funds that they refuse to use efficiently, and they refuse to work. So therefore, they are scared of being bullied by them by having to sacrifice their programs for homeless people and now give it to those who are living in shacks and informal settlements. So yes, they are not coming together. They are very much separate, and they want to keep it that way.
Thank you. Yeah, so it does seem that there needs to be some greater degree of integration there across those two policy areas. I should have mentioned earlier that we've put into the chat box our little evaluation link, and we ask everyone, please, before you leave, just to download that and fill it in. Take you less than a minute, and you know how it works. It's just very useful feedback for us and for our funders. Also an opportunity for you to make suggestions about other topics that you would like us to cover in this way. So please do take the little bit of trouble to complete that form for us. And I saw also that there was reference to a couple of the reports that Nick mentioned earlier. We will, well, my colleague Kenny, I'm sure, will try to get the links for those and make those available to everyone as well. Okay, I think the last question that's just come in has been answered, that densification of urban areas is that preferred solution to the problem of continued urbanization. I think the answer is yes, we have to have some degree of densification. Question before that is around speed of approvals being critical. Do you propose a mix between a fully subsidized and open market? I'm not sure that I completely understand that, but once again, Nick is nodding. So over to you.
I'm always nodding Mike when I'm hearing something, but yeah, I mean, I see those almost as two separate questions. So I'm going to answer them as such. In terms of the speed of approvals, at least to my understanding, that's talking about planning approvals. You know, people, developers, anyone that wants to build needs to apply to get approval from their municipality. And often there are huge backlogs in how long those approvals take. And it's a significant factor that slows down development. It's a tough one. I think there's two ways you could speed up approvals, and I think the first one is probably most realistic. So the first way is you could adjust the planning system so that it stops dealing with what Kathy Stone, who's the former director of planning in the Western Province, used to describe as rats and mice, which is things like someone wants to extend their stoop by 40 centimeters, or they want to add another window into their, single-story house or whatever. That stuff ends up kind of really clogging up the planning system. And of course, you know, it's difficult to decide where you draw that line because we have a planning system and an approval system for a reason, you know, which is that the state has some control over what gets built. But I truly believe, as you know, as someone that spent a lot of time sitting in municipal planning tribunal meetings, there are so many sort of non-issues or insignificant planning issues that then end up really clogging up the system and preventing more significant or more impactful developments from taking shape and from actually moving forward. It causes a lot of delays. And then the second question there is about whether we propose a mixture between fully subsidized and open market housing. And that has, you know, since about 2017 been the position that our organization takes and what we advocate for, because for a number of reasons, the main one is that it increases the financial feasibility or viability of building homes and making sure that, you know, strategic pieces of land, their value and potential is maximized. So if you include some open market homes, you can use some of the revenue that generates to cross-subsidize some of the more affordable homes and to make sure that the rents are cheaper or the purchase price is cheaper and that they can remain affordable for longer. So I also think that the social integration that engenders is something that, you know, we desperately lack in South African cities. So yeah, would advocate for that in many scenarios, not in all scenarios, but in very many of them. And Johan, I invite you to check out Ndifuna Ukwazi's website, where we have a list of publications where we kind of break down the issue of mixed income housing in a lot more detail.
Thank you. We're coming towards the end. There is one further question, which I think is an important one. And Annette, I'm going to see whether you have thoughts on this one around the question of farm worker evictions and whether the white paper addresses the needs of this very vulnerable, often peri-urban and rural sector. Any thoughts on that one?
It's a very important question. We have an extensive legislative framework that deals with farm worker evictions. The white paper doesn't delve into it into any specific degree. I need to go back and specifically look to see the degree of detail around farm worker evictions. But in South Africa, we do have a very developed legislative framework around farm workers evictions. And there's a distinction that is made between the evictions which are governed in terms of what's known as the PI Act, which has application in urban areas, and then the Extension of Security of Tenure Act, which has application in agricultural areas, rural areas, peri-urban areas. The concern is that despite this progressive legislative framework, that we are seeing that it is often undermined in terms of processing, in terms of a less than progressive approach taken by our courts in terms of court judgments, and then also the failure to actually implement judgments and to ensure that it is followed to the degree as set out in court orders. And so it's not so much that we need necessarily an overhaul of the legislative system, but the enabling framework around that needs it's an entire webinar on its own. And yeah, I'm sorry that we can't do that now, but yeah, thank you.
Maybe that's something just to flag for the future and to look at doing a webinar or something on predominantly rural and peri-urban human settlements and homelessness, etc. Because it is ultimately always a neglected